No. Well, we go teach you, when you're doing it, what it will smell like. It's, for like a meal or, wordless term, all the melody, and certain melody, units that they've already taught and seen them during certain parts, certain times of the year. Or yeah. You want this one. Little consequence. 100.
Huh? Four meals. What melody?
So there's certain like ignorance.
Oh, there's it's a whole world. There's Nagunim for everything. There's the whole idea is that words are confining, right? Words are too defining. They're too they trap us. And so the idea of a nigun is that it's just the melody. It has no words to it. So it allows us to, you can find yourself in it. It's not like you're stuck to a song with certain words. So there's hundreds of different nigunim that are all wordless, just in the universal language of ay ay ay.
I was going to go. I wanted to.
I was singing one just now. Ay yeah 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 yeah. Ah yeah 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 yeah. Ah yeah 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 yeah. But there's like, you have some that are, stanzas and parts and go on for all these different changes. There's a Hasidic group called Muzhich. Muzhich was a town in somewhere in like Poland or Hungary or something. And they're like, of all the Hasidic groups, they're like the most musical. Their like whole deal is just Nigunim. And they had a Rebbe, like their leader, who I think he died in like the 80s, the 70s and the 80s. Like there's a pretty recent story. He had to go for an operation and they wanted to put him under. And he refused. And they wanted to do local and he refused. And it was something nuts. Like they were cutting him open big time. And like the whole thing took like a couple of hours, the surgery. And he, from before they started, he just started singing a nigun. He was composing it on the spot. And he sang this nigun for like 3 or 4 hours while they did the whole operation. And then they sewed him back up and then he went out.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's such a thing as Talmudic Judaism.
Talmudic Judaism? All Judaism is Talmudic
Yeah,
Judaism.
that's what I'm saying. I'm trying to argue with you that it's Talmudic. It doesn't make
There are a few branches of I don't know if they would, I guess technically you would consider them Jewish. They're not really Jewish. There's a group called the Karaites. They basically don't exist. They have one synagogue in maybe they have a couple of synagogues in Israel. They only have one in America. It's right outside of where I grew up in San Francisco. And they are literalist fundamentalists who don't believe in the oral tradition, who don't believe in the Talmud. And you get there have been croppings up throughout history of these people. During the Talmud times, they called themselves the Sadducees. They called themselves the Sadukim. They didn't last. And then they became known as the Karaites. And they were like, during the Rambam's time, there was a big like Karaite uprising or like Renaissance. The Rambam wrote a lot against them. And then since then, they basically don't exist. They have like a couple of shuls in the world. I mean, maybe there's 1,000 of them. There was a whole story a couple of years ago. They had their first convert in like ever. In Daly City, which is right outside of San Francisco. I know they have one synagogue in Jerusalem, and the Sumerians look very similar in practice, but the Sumerians don't consider themselves Jewish, just the Karaites. They're the only non-Talmudic Judaism I could think of.
So somebody said Talmudic Judaism doesn't make sense or isn't accurate or is bad. That's saying that the whole entire Judaism is bad.
Yeah, essentially.
You say there was a Karaite facility in San Francisco.
It's in Daly City, which is right outside of San Francisco. It's like basically where the San Francisco airport is. I've never been. It's actually like, how's it going? It's officially, you're not allowed to go in one. It got so heated that it became that you're not allowed to go in one of the synagogues. How you doing?
Good.
I'm Kanan.
Richard.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
How you doing?
You too.
Kanan.
Good. How are you?
Hey.
Very hot.
Nice to meet you. You guys help yourself to a bagel. Daly City, yeah. Okay, so I made new copies. I think we should be squared away for we got our work cut out for us for the next while. I didn't even copy the whole thing, so we got a ways to go. So we left off last week that nobody had a copy and everybody was just taking my word for what it said, right? So now you can fact check me. So we'll backtrack a little bit just so we're all on the same page. I think we're really probably on page 135 or 36. We started talking about the Mishnah, right? We had a long conversation about. That's a good segue. We had a long conversation about how the Talmud works, right? And the nature of Jewish wisdom being shared and transmitted in a very concise manner, and that within that brevity contains all the wisdom, right? And that the system that Rebbe, who wrote the Mishnah, developed was that in in creating these rules and these principles for how the Mishnah works. So then within each, very brief teaching of a couple of sentences, there's contained all this information that if you know what you're reading and you know what the rules are, then you can break it down. And then the Talmud, the Gemara, then will go on for pages and pages discussing this super brief idea, right? And we were using that to understand this idea. Back to our original question, right? We have these two names of God that tell us in our tradition two opposite forces that are revelation and concealment, and that within the two, we also have the simultaneous tradition that they are the same, that they don't oppose each other, but they are in fact all one. And so we're trying to understand how they could both oppose each other and not oppose each other, right? So till now, we've been presenting this idea, this concept that the concealment isn't a concealment, and so really they are two sides of the same coin. But we were sort of unsatisfied with that answer because at the end of the day, we're still adamant that it is a concealment. Meaning to say, we have this idea of Havaya, of Yudke, Vavke, of Adonai, which is the way that God interacts with creation in a way of expression, in a way of outward expression. And that we're saying that is what we're calling revelation. And then we have this other concept of Elohim, which seems to be the way godliness is concealed in the world, right? The natural order in which we don't perceive overt godliness. And for us to say that Elohim isn't concealment, just to sort of justify how we could say that maybe they're all one, is unsatisfactory because there's a concealment going on, right? We can't deny that there's a concealment, but we still have to square this away with the fact that they're both one, right? So that's sort of where we've gotten to. And so we're trying to go deeper into the concept of specifically analogies and metaphors as a way to understand what the nature of concealment is and where exactly does the feature of concealment occur, right? We're saying that God is that Elohim is this representation of concealment, the ways in which godliness is no longer overt, which gives us space to be us, right? The sun rising in the east and setting in the west every day, to the point that we can make a clock that we all agree on when it's 10 o'clock and we all know when it's 2 o'clock, and we have this system of time, is all essentially divine, but it is concealed in the physical, in the material world, and in the natural order of things. So much so that the godliness is no longer apparent, right? We live in a world where you can make a sundial and you think that there's 24 hours in a day, and that's the beginning and the end of the conversation, right? Time would seem to be this thing that just marches on, and it's not necessarily involved within the conversation of God, right? But Elohim is the way in which is the system in which godliness can be concealed in such a way that there is the consistency and the regularity and the continuity to existence within the natural order. So all of this is a real concealment. So we can't say that it's not a concealment, but we have to understand a little bit better where the concealment is happening. Where is that being hidden? And what we're going to get to is that in the relationship, the Kabbalah talks about this. One of the things that it focuses on is this relationship of mashpia and makabel, giver and receiver, or in our example here, a teacher and a student, and the relationship between the two and how they interact and how things are transmitted from one to the other, and the ways, the sort of the nature of each one's experience. And with that, we're going to get to the teacher has to conceal in order to reveal. He has to conceal in order to transmit wisdom, to transmit information. But that concealment is a function or is a feature of the experience of the receiver, not necessarily of the giver. So that's what we're going to look at today. That's what we're going to go deep into. So we're on page 133 It should be the first page in everybody's packets. Lahaven bir advarim anal v'lchere any moving v'halei kol in shem elikim hu l'tamtem l'hailam v'eich nema she'ena mailam klal. Deich afshali yeshneim she'mailam v'eina mailam. Our question is, being everything that we've said till now, as deep as we've gone into the weeds about this whole idea, we tried to really commit to the idea that Elikim doesn't contradict or oppose Havaya, that concealment isn't opposite to revelation, that they're both the same, right? And he's saying, like, we built this whole house of cards, but it's sort of tenuous, this whole structure, right? Because at the end of the day, we can't remove the element of concealment from Elikim. It has to be concealing. So how do we understand that? So let's continue, page 135. We did do this last week because I remember that there was a mistake here. So we'll understand this by our own experience in the ways we relate to a teacher, right? I'm sure each one of us has been a student and each one of us has been a teacher in some way. So it's an accessible metaphor, an accessible analogy for us to understand. When the student is far removed from the teacher, right? Like we mentioned last time, if Einstein is trying to teach arithmetic, so the teacher has to conceal and package and be very deliberate and careful about how he packages the information in a way that it's accessible for the student. Because he has to be able to identify the limitations of the student's understanding and the student's capacities in what he's able to understand. So he's required, he has to conceal the majority and in some ways even the essence of the concept in order for it to be shared in a way that is accessible for the student, right? When we're sharing these ideas, and we mentioned the same thing in speech, that speech has to conceal the essence of the thought in order for only the most superficial or external part of the concept to be shared through speech, right? Because we have these confines of the nature of words and words definition, so those limitations really box in a concept to be only the most external, the most superficial part of the concept relative to how it is in our own mind when we're thinking about it ourselves. Right? That if the teacher were to just start rapid fire going the way it is clear for him in his own mind, so it would become totally overwhelming and indiscernible for the student. It would not be an effective relationship and an effective way to share information. So rather, the way that is effective, our tradition is that the teacher has to learn. Part of learning pedagogy as a teacher is learning how to contain and how to conceal, how to, within a concept and within the transmission of the concept, contain the essence of the information in a way that is accessible and that is engageable for the student, that is containable, that the student can wrap his head around, that a student cannot feel overwhelmed by. So and in fact, not only does he have to contain within the tradition or within the way that he's sharing this information, he has to figure out a way to insert, but yet at the same time conceal the essence of the information. in a way that can make it accessible, but he has to employ something like a metaphor or an analogy, something that is totally foreign to the concept in order to make it understood. Right? We mentioned last time that we're giving analogies to understand the notion of analogies, right? So we're talking about this whole concept of teacher and student. This analogy is we can use it even though it's totally foreign to the way God relates to existence, right? Which is what we're trying to understand ultimately. It helps us as something that we can conceive of, as something that we can wrap our head around, as something that we each have experience in, that therefore we can all reflect on the different intricacies and nuances of a student-teacher relationship, and that will help us go deeper into understanding a little more about God, right? So the essence of what he's saying over here is that you need something that's totally foreign to help you understand it, right? If it were too close to the original information, right? If the analogy is too close to what we're talking about or to the subject matter, to the essence of the information, so then it just starts to get muddy. It just starts to get very confusing, and it's hard to draw those distinctions, and it's hard to relate to it necessarily. It's hard to grasp it and to really integrate it. So we pick something that's totally foreign to the concept, and in that foreignness, we're able to understand that as its own thing, and then by our powers of deduction and reason and intellect, we're able to come back to the actual concept that we're trying to understand and superimpose all those ideas or extract those ideas onto what we're actually interested in. On top page 136, so the same is true of an analogy. So that's also a mistake. So the analogy covers over, it conceals the analog that when we talk about the relationship between a student and a teacher, right? It's no big secret to say that we're not really interested in the student or the teacher, right? This isn't something that we care about because we're trying to understand pedagogy, right? It all is in service to how we can understand God better. In understanding the analogy, so within it is concealed, ultimately, the reason why we're talking about it is because it contains within it in some way the essence of an element of the dynamic between God and creation. And that's why it serves us. That's why we invest in trying to understand it. That's why it's useful as an analogy. Because at some point when we uncover it, we can see that at its core lies something about what we're actually trying to understand. So too in the ways in which we're saying that an analogy parallels clothes, right? That it clothes the concept, right? It covers over and has this element. It contains other elements of clothing as well, which is that clothing is tailor-made to the person, right? Clothing is meant to fit the person. And in Kabbalah, we talk about, and we've spoken about this before, the idea of makif, right? Makif is this idea of surrounding, right? It's one of the ways in which God relates to creation. There is the way of pnimi, of namala, the way in which God infuses things with vitality that would be tailor-made, would be defined by how much something can contain. The analogy we often use for this is the study of Torah, right? Where each one of us understands differently and each one of us has different intellectual capacities. So therefore, each one of us can only contain so much information and so much understanding. Whereas the opposite of that is a mitzvah, where we all do the same mitzvah the same way, and it is not about the intention or about the thought behind it, but it is purely in the action of it. And in that sense, we all do the same mitzvahs. So that would be the makif, the surrounding idea, where it's totally not user-defined, where it's totally top-down. So within Makif, we distinguish that there's two elements to it. The two analogies to understand Makif would be something like a house, right, or a building, where we can go into the building where it surrounds us, and the building is unaffected by us being there, right? So barring the example of like, breaking the fire code and like having too many people in a building, pretty much a building is unaffected by people walking in and out of it. Whereas clothes, even though they surround us and they're in some ways unaffected by us, right? When we stop wearing them, they go back in the drawer and they're not having a different experience, but they're still sort of tailor-made to us. They still sort of contain us and contain an element of being oriented towards the user, even though they are a makif, they are a covering, a surrounding energy. So in this sense, when we talk about the mashal, the idea of an analogy, it is something that is disconnected from the essential information, but yet it still has some relationship to it. It's not like a house where it's totally independent and totally unaffected. There's some relationship in between the two, and that is like the analogy of clothes. So for a effective analogy, it has to be done deliberately and intentionally, that it should fit the concept, right? It can't just be, you can't just like start throwing out ideas of totally random concepts that we should try to superimpose back onto what we're trying to understand, right? If we said, if trying to understand the relationship between Havai and Elikim, and instead of talking about a teacher and student, we started talking about penguins, it would be ineffective unless there was some significant element to the relationship between penguins, right? Does that make sense? Okay. So we're going to look at this idea of the Mishnah. This is the last thing that we spoke about on page 137. The Talmud teaches us that a person should always transmit information. He should always teach in a concise manner. Not to reveal, not to share within the first experience the essence of where a person of the information. Rather, he should find a way that is concise, a brief way to share the more superficial part of the information. To share only what is accessible for the student, only what the student can engage with that seems on the student's level, in a way that the true depth and the true breadth of the concept is hidden, is not overtly expressed. This is the beginning of the way that Jewish wisdom is, and the Jewish tradition has been transmitted over millennia, right? Just to recap what we said last week, the tradition is that when Moshe received the Torah on Mount Sinai, he received both the scroll itself, right, the written Torah, as well as the oral tradition that goes alongside the written Torah. And we said that the nature of the transmission of the Torah was such that when you open up the Torah itself, the written Torah, its purpose is to tell us how to do mitzvahs, right? That is the purpose of the Torah, right? The word Torah comes from the word hora'ah, which means instruction. So it's an instruction manual. But the way in which it's written, there's very few, if any, mitzvahs that you can really understand how to do them directly from the Torah, right? When it tells us to, it doesn't tell us. The example we gave last week was tefillin, right? Tefillin is these black boxes that we put on our arms and on our heads every day. And not only does it not even say the word tefillin anywhere in the Torah, but all of the hallmarks of tefillin, that it's square, that it's black, that it's made out of leather, that it contains scrolls within it. None of this is written in the Torah anywhere. This is all The verse tells us that you shall tie them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be a totafos, whatever that means. There's a lot of disagreement about what the word totafos means. It's not even necessarily of Hebrew origin. And it should be a totafos between your eyes, right? Like it's a totally vague, cryptic statement that we have no idea what it's talking about. And yet, going back to the earliest archaeological digs, every tefillin that they've ever found all look the same. They're all square and made out of leather and black, right? And this is because the oral tradition was something that was passed down from generation to generation. And so Rabbi Yehuda Anasi, he wrote down the Mishnah after the destruction of the first temple. And he made it while it was never meant to be written down. And he actually had to, it was like a very bold move at the time for him to write it down. So he wrote it down and he specifically developed these principles in a way that it can be shared, that it can contain all the depth of Jewish tradition and of Jewish wisdom, and yet still be tremendously concise and tremendously brief. That, kids start learning Mishnah at 6 years old these days, and you can have a very elementary relationship with it, or you can go very deep in it. And the Talmud is the example of going very deep in it, in that the Gemara, the bulk of what the Talmud is really composed of is the Gemara, which is the later commentary or the later conversations that the rabbis are having about these very brief lines in the Mishnah. So this all comes from this teaching that the Talmud tells us about teaching briefly. And the idea is ultimately that it's not just that it's an effective way of pedagogy, but in fact, the entire transmission of information, of intellect, has to be done in a way that is brief, that is deliberate, and that is concealed. But that doesn't mean that at any point are we withholding withholding any type of information in the essence of what we're trying to convey. It's that the process of teaching has to be deliberate in the word choice and the analogy choice, the metaphor choice, in how we're able to contain and conceal such an essential, the essence of a topic, in something that can be superficially approachable. Right, so that it will be transmitted in a way where the essence of the concept and the depth of the concept, right, the ultimate depth, the true secrets of the Torah, can even be concealed in simple ideas and simple concepts and simple matters, and that they can be shared, and that things can exist on multiple strata, on multiple planes, and then a 6-year-old can learn the same thing that an old person is learning, and they're learning it on 2 different levels, right? So what we have is this hierarchy of how Jewish tradition is developed, is that we have these concepts, and that within them contains the depths, the secrets of the Torah, right? We know there's a tradition of this idea called Pardes. Pardes literally means an orchard, and it is a tradition about the 4 strata, the 4 like planes upon which any concept can exist. So the P stands for pshat, which means a simple understanding. The R stands for remez, which means the allegorical, or that which is hinted to. The D stands for drush, which means the metaphorical, or like a deeper understanding. And then the S stands for side, which means the mystical. Side means a secret, so it means the mystical, right? So any concept that we have can exist on all 4 of these planes simultaneously, and yet when the Mishnah will tell us something in brevity and concisely and seem to only express maybe the most superficial part of it, or the most external part of it. Not only is there within that contained an entire conversation that is fleshed out in the Talmud, that can be pages and pages where they go into tremendous depth, but that could even be still on a pshat level or a remez level, right? Then there's still further a drush level, and there's still further a side level, and all of those can exist simultaneously, and can all be contained within one teaching of a Mishnah. That we can see all of that once we start to train our mind to learn the system and the rules of how things are there. But that's all within. That was all part of Rebbe's kavana, part of his intentionality, the deliberate way that he authored the Mishnah, and that he developed those rules on how Mishnah should be taught and understood, in that all of that is accessible when we have the tools to uncover it all. Look, my Mishnah Shoshana Lana Rabbeinu HaKadosh Harizak Kitzer, the last paragraph on 138. Hakitzer Mikol Arichas Apilpol Ba'emek Erech V'Rechav Shohaya Atlam Ba'inin Shana Lanu Kol Zer Rabbeinu HaKadosh B'Lashon HaMishnah B'Kitzer Nimratz Sheyiyah Lefi Arkenu. Aval Ba'emes Yesh B'Lashon HaMishnah Kol Emek V'Rechav Pnimius V'Atzmis Chachmosam V'Kmesh B'Gmara Mavor Achakach Prate Elashon HaMishnah Ba'emek Erech V'Rechav HaMishnah Hu B'Helam. Right, like we just said, that the Mishnah is extremely concise, but it contains within it. It has to be there in some essential state, all of the information that is ultimately fleshed out through all the subsequent generations and subsequent conversations. It all has to be there, present within the Mishnah in some essential state. On the next page, on top of page 140, hu ba'ashpas ha'seichel shemashpia mailim ba'hashefa kol emechach mosei elashu nela mamakabel. Similarly, in the way information is transmitted from the teacher to the student, the teacher mailim ba'hashefa kol emechach mosei, the teacher has to hide, he has to conceal the depth of the wisdom, of the insight, of the concept that he transmits. It has to be there present in some way. It can't be disconnected from the essence of the information, but it has to be concealed in such a way that it is not apparent to the receiver, to the student. Right? So it's there and it's not there. It's like a bad magic trick, right? So then only what the student perceives is only what's on his level. But that doesn't mean to say that the rest isn't there, right? Like we're going to say, probably pretty soon, that, and I think I mentioned it last week, this teaching, this concept that it takes 40 years for a person to understand the teaching of his teachers, right? Because for 40 years, a person can continue to go deeper and to relate to it differently. And only after 40 years does it exist by the student, for the student, and within the student's mind, the same way it exists for the teacher, right? With that same clarity, with that same essentiality. So this capacity to conceal is an expression of the power of limitation, which is something that we've been discussing as an element of an essential element to the way God relates to creation. That there is this capacity, this koyach hagilui, this capacity to reveal, capacity to express, and this koyach hagbala, the opposite, the capacity to conceal, right? And we're saying that so too, just like this is essential to God's relationship, to the way he relates to creation, so too this is essential to how our intellect works. So too this is essential to the process of transmitting and transferring information, the process of learning and sharing. So what comes out is that the concealment that is taking place is only apparent or is only a feature that is experienced by the receiver, by the student. For the teacher, there's no concealment going on. There's nothing is concealed, nothing is hidden. It's a tool that he might employ in order for successful, effective transmission of information, but that doesn't mean at any point that he's experiencing it himself. Right? When Rabbi writes down the Mishnah and he's using this system that he's developed that facilitates its brevity, while it seems that there are certain deeper understandings or deeper layers that are hidden within it, it's only hidden when we're coming to it as a 6-year-old and we're learning it for the first time, or even older, right? When in this process of investigation of fleshing it out and trying to understand it, right? When Einstein has to teach arithmetic to a 10-year-old, he's maybe only expressing the arithmetic, he's only sharing the arithmetic, but that doesn't mean that for him there's any concealment of quantum physics. It's just that he's concealing all of that in order for the student to understand the arithmetic. Right? So the whole function, the whole feature of concealment is only something that exists by the recipient. And the same is true by analogies. When a person gives an analogy, the way that he comes up with or devises or constructs that analogy, he has to be able to see all of the intricacies of how the analogy relates to the analog, right? That which is being concealed, right? So when the Rebbe Rashab is teaching here, and he's using the author of this discourse is teaching here, and he's saying that the teacher-student model of can help us understand a little more about God. So the way he's able to do that is because he sees within the student-teacher model something about God, right? Whereas we have to go into the weeds to understand the analogy itself, all of the elements of a student-teacher model, right? We have to address that as a separate topic. And once we understand that, then we can go back to trying to understand God a little better. For him, employing that analogy, it's already clear. It's already the essence of the concept is already within the analogy. Right, and not only is it just that there's sort of like a disconnected relationship, but for one who is conceiving of the analogy, for one who is employing the analogy as this method to share information, all of the intricacies are there, right? That's what makes it a successful and effective analogy. That's why he's using that one versus another one. So let's give an analogy, right? Ukumai, the second to last paragraph on page 140. Ukumai al darech mashal ha'aretz hagashmi. For example, the analogy is the earth, the physical world, and specifically the earth, the ground, the dirt, that which things grow from. Hu mashal lebchinas malchus shelamayla. Kabbalah tells us that to understand the heavenly sphere of malchus, of kingship, also known as dignity or sovereignty, we can look at the way in which the physical ground sprouts forth things, right? So we have 10 spheres, and these spheres are 10 spheres, 10 modes through which God relates to creation, through which the process of creation is facilitated, right? they are 3 intellectual and 7 emotional. That is how we conceive of them, right? When we map them out onto our own experience, they apply to that we conceive of them being, or we perceive of them being 3 intellectual, wisdom, understanding, knowledge, right? That's Chabad. So, like we gave the example of Archimedes, and how that story contains all 3 elements of wisdom or insight, understanding, extrapolation, investigation, and knowledge about connection. Then there are 7 what are called emotional, and they are how we relate on a more emotional level, much more interpersonally than the intellect. The intellect is more our own experience, whereas emotion is much more about how we relate to others. And the last of that is Malchus, is this concept of sovereignty or dignity. Malchus literally means kingship or kingdom, right? A Melech is a king. So Malchus is identified as, in this system of spheres, Kabbalah talks about how it starts with the intellect, and then so in the way that God relates, the way that we use them to understand these modes by which God is relating to creation, right? Because we have everything is trying to understand how we go from infinite to finite, right? God is totally infinite, and then all of a sudden there's finitude, right? And those are, and there's no relationship between finite and infinite. So we have to assume that there's some type of quantum leap that is required to go from one to the other. That's where we develop this idea of tzimtzum, of this quantum concealment that allowed for the capacity of finitude, right? And with that, the way that godliness began to be revealed within the finite state is through these 10 spheres, these 10 modalities of relating, and that are the 10 spheres of the spheres. So Malchus is the last one, is all about that which gives birth, right? Malchus is connected with the mouth. We're told that it's about speech, right? Speech is giving birth to ideas and sharing them in a way that they become their own thing, right? It's about giving birth in a literal sense. And it's also about the way the earth sprouts forth and gives birth to vegetative matter, right? To plants and things like that. So Kabbalah tells us that we can look at the ground and we can meditate on the way that trees and plants and vegetables grow forth from the ground, and this sort of wild generative capacity that seems to be, latent in the ground, and we can use all of that. We can go deep in our mind to understand that, and that'll help us understand a little bit more what this thing of Malchus is, right? So he says, "Ukmail derech mashal ha'aretz hagashmi u'mashal b'china Malchus shalamayla hainu aviyusei v'chudurosei v'chevdei u'mashem atzmiach tzumachim harei zeh mashal b'chinas Malchus datzilus shemahaven Ephraim debiyah ma'ayin liyesh k'mish kozim nokum achem." All of the nuances that we see in the earth, we can apply to our understanding of Malchus, right? The more in detail we go to understand its aviyusei, its thickness, v'chudurosei, its roundness, v'chevdei, its heaviness, right? All of these elements that we apply to the earth, that we understand about the earth, we can extrapolate from that, and we can start to look at, it can help infuse a deeper understanding in Malchus. And especially when we see the way in which a tree is able, you can put a seed in the ground and then a tree grows from that, and then from that tree is born fruit, and fruit has a physical sweetness. We're told in Kabbalah that physical sweetness is a representation of chesed and is an expression of chesed, which is kindness, which is, for example, why we like to eat apples on Rosh Hashanah, right? That's why we sort of work that into the experience. The apples in general, Kabbalists are obsessed with apples. Apples sort of serve this interesting place in Kabbalah. Different conversation for a different time. But we can use apples as a way to reflect on this deeper concept, which is God's kindness, which is ultimately what we're trying to activate over the Rosh Hashanah, over the high holiday experience, right? So we take apples and put it in honey, and we reflect on that same idea. But it's a multi-layered process, because we can also look at the fact that it comes from a seed that was put in the ground, and that's born out of Malchus, that's born out of this dignity, out of this sovereignty, and how the ground has this generative aspect to it that relates, that maps out onto Malchus. So the more we look at the ground, the more we can understand Malchus. And in fact, the deepest meditation when it comes to Malchus, or when it comes to looking at the ground, is not only to reflect on Malchus as a sphere, individual or singular, right? Focusing on that sphere individually, rather, is a very poorly constructed sentence. But not to hyper focus on Malchus itself, but rather ultimately to realize the interconnectedness and the essential chain that aligns and connects everything, right? To see that nothing is disconnected from its source. Just like a tree grows out of the ground, and we see that the tree is intrinsically connected with its source, we can broaden that perspective, apply that to realize that everything in this world, even though we walk around and we feel disconnected from our source, and there's all these things that are in the world that seem disconnected from their source, and it doesn't even seem like there's necessarily is a source, right? But Malchus, looking at the ground and looking at the relationship between the ground and the trees that are growing from the ground, helps us to understand that everything is connected with its source. And that ultimately, it is ultimately God's infinite power, which is being expressed in the physical. But it's totally rooted, it's totally sourced in the infinite, in the singular of God Almighty. Shebe'emes, continuing on page 141, Shebe'emes ha'mashal ba'animshal hem davar echad, ela shezeh ruchni v'zeh gashmi. And in fact, the true nature of relationship of analogies is the relationship between the analogy and the analog is that they're totally one and the same, but that one is physical and one is spiritual, right? That the ground and Malchus are ultimately the same thing. They're just manifesting, they're just presenting differently. So therefore, the more we look at the ground, the more we can extrapolate from that, the more we can go deeper into understanding Malchus. And this is in fact what the experience is of perceiving godliness in the physical. We might think that it's just an intellectual exercise to sit and to meditate on the ground and the way the trees are coming out of the ground, the ways in which things grow, right? We could think that that's maybe some type of meditation. We could think that that's some type of, thought trip, right? But it is in fact seeing godliness in a physical form. That's ultimately what we experience. And this is all the ways in which the capacity to limit, the koach hagbola, the ability to contain, to conceal information, allows for the growth and the realization in the transmission of information. Nimsa shelagabe mashpia, ein kan shum helen v'hester klal, kim lagabe amikabel, hu helen v'hester. And it comes out, we see now, that the concealment is only a function that is being perceived by the recipient, by the student, by the one who is receiving the information. And this is that what has been made accessible in the transmission is only the most superficial external part of the concept, but that ultimately, deep down within that transmission, has to be the essence of the concept in its most essential way, the same way it is understood and grasped by the teacher. Right? Which is why you can have a teacher who is ineffective, right? Or is not good, because his grasp is tenuous, and then he's trying to find other ways, he's trying to find ways to express it. And because his grasp is tenuous, so then the analogies and the examples that he's going to give are also going to be tenuous, they're also going to be insufficient. Aval Primus, if this is sounding like anybody's experience right now, then we should talk. Aval Primus, Aval Atmis Nala Mimenu. But the essence of the concept has to be hidden. It has to be only in an essential way. It can't be overt, because that will overwhelm. I don't know what this note is over here. I'm sure it's really nice. Continuing on page 148. But the fact of the matter is, don't get discouraged. It's not a true concealment, right? It's not that it's not there, right? Or if it's not present, that doesn't mean that it's not accessible. Because even if what is only apparent is the most external, the most superficial, part of the information, it doesn't mean that the essence or the deeper elements are not there helping to infuse one's understanding, that they're not working as some background process. They can be there in some highly abstract, highly concealed form, but they are still contributing to the experience, to the fullness and the robustness of the experience. Because the concealment and the nature of concealment is that while it has to contain, right? While, for example, in speech, while words have to have definition, and while it is only within the confines of words having definition that we can express and we can share these concepts, right? That makes speech an effective way to share thoughts, right? As this bridge, right? It is the nature of this concealment is such that it serves the purpose and ultimately is a tool for revelation, right? Not to get carried away to think that it is just merely a concealment, right? Again, that without the confinement, there wouldn't be any way to transmit any relation, any information, right? If words didn't have definition, they would be ineffective in sharing ideas. They would be ineffective for speech, right? We were talking about a nigun before, about these wordless melodies, right? They are a soul experience, but they don't, and they might share something in the tune, and they might share something more essential, but they don't convey information in any effective way, right? Each person's experience with them is different, right? That's part of the beauty of these melodies. But when it comes to words, we need words to have definition in order for them to be effective in transmitting this information. And without that concealment, without those confines, they wouldn't be effective tools to share the essence of the concept. Right? Like we said, that if the teacher was to just reveal everything the way he understood it, it would totally overwhelm the student. So if in fact it is this concealment, which remember, the concealment is something that while the teacher constructs, it is not, he doesn't experience it. So if he constructs it, but he's not experiencing it, and then for the student, it is there as a mode, as a method to facilitate his understanding, as a method to facilitate revelation. So therefore, it also doesn't truly exist by him either. right? It's both sort of, it's almost like a figment of everybody's experience, right? It's not real for the teacher because he's only using it to relate to the student, but it doesn't exist at all for him in anything other than an effective teaching aid. And for the student, it's only there as in service to the revelation, in service of the understanding, which is a revelatory state, which is a revealed state, right? So for the student also, it's not truly there. It's only like a temporary thing that is part of the process of uncovering the information, of receiving information to uncover it and to own it, to make it their own. So we'll hold it over here. So that's where we're, that's how we'll get into this idea of just exactly what exactly is the teacher providing the student with, and how does the student relate to it in his own way. We're going to introduce concepts of Or Yashar and Or Chayzer, which means the straight light and the returning light, right? Which are two modalities in which we can relate to things or information. So stay tuned for next week. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.